October 26, 1942, the waters of the South Pacific boiled beneath the relentless assault of Japanese dive bombers. Overhead, black smoke from anti-aircraft bursts hung in the humid air like storm clouds of death. The USS Enterprise CV-6, America's last operational carrier in the Solomon Islands, zigzagged violently through waves of incoming fire. From the bridge, Captain Osborne B. Hardison gripped the railing, his knuckles white beneath the red emergency lights. The roar of engines, the shriek of bombs falling, and the shattering explosions on the flight deck blended into a single deafening chaos. Incoming, starboard dive bombers. A lookout yelled. Sailors raced across the deck, hauling hoses, loading anti-aircraft guns, shouting commands that were drowned out by the scream of an IIC D3A Val diving from the clouds. Its wings glinted in the sunlight then, a blinding flash. The deck erupted. Shrapnel tore through steel and flesh. Smoke and flame engulfed the forward elevator. Below deck, engineering crews fought to contain fires as oil lines burst and water flooded compartments. The air grew thick with burning fuel. Men stumbled through the smoke, some carrying wounded shipmates, others grabbing extinguishers or turning valves to keep the engines alive. The ship's very heart beat. Its turbines trembled, but kept turning. Commander William Bill Davis, in charge of damage control, barked orders as his men battled flames, reaching 2 decks high. "Don't let her die," he shouted, sweat streaking through the soot on his face. Every second mattered. For hours, the Japanese kept coming, wave after wave, striking again and again. By evening, the Enterprise was bleeding smoke across the Pacific, its deck pockmarked with craters, its crew exhausted and half-deaf from the barrage. Then, as darkness fell, radio silence broke. From nearby cruisers came grim words. "Enterprise is dead in the water." But in the control room, Captain Hardison refused to yield. "She's not dead," he said quietly, staring at the glowing embers of his ship. "Not while we can still fight." The grey ghost had just taken her first beating, and she wasn't done yet. The sun rose pale and crimson over the Solomon Sea, casting its reflection across the shattered deck of the USS Enterprise. Smoke still curled from the twisted steel, and the stench of burnt aviation fuel lingered in every corridor. The ship that had once been the pride of Task Force 16 now limped through the Pacific, her engines groaning, her deck scarred, her crew silent except for the steady rhythm of repair hammers echoing in the dawn. More than 100 sailors were dead or wounded. The medics worked without pause, tending to men burned, broken, and shell-shocked. In the hangar bay, makeshift stretchers lay between the skeletal remains of aircraft. Wildcat fighters reduced to charred frames. Petty Officer Harlan Beck, his arm wrapped in bloodied bandages, whispered, "We're done for this time. She can't make it." But Captain Hardison's voice came over the loudspeaker, gravelly but defiant. "Crew of the Enterprise, we took everything they threw at us, and we're still afloat. If they think we're finished, they don't know the Big E." The words traveled like electricity through the wounded ship. Men, too tired to stand, smiled faintly. Those who could still move picked up their tools and began to rebuild, patching, welding, tightening bolts by hand. Escort destroyers circled protectively as the carrier turned east toward Espiritu Santo for emergency repairs. The sea was calm, but every creak of the hull sounded like a cry of pain. Below deck, the damage control teams kept the pumps running day and night to hold back the flooding dot in the sky above. Japanese reconnaissance planes passed, scanning the area. Seeing only a column of smoke and debris trailing in the distance, they radioed back to Rabaul. USS Enterprise confirmed sunk. When the message reached Japanese naval headquarters, officers celebrated. To them, America's last carrier in the South Pacific was gone. The balance of power now theirs. Admiral Naguma reportedly said, "The ghost of Midway is finally laid to rest." But deep inside the battered hull of the Enterprise, the engineers were already making the impossible decision to bring her back to life. November 1st, 1942, somewhere in the South Pacific, the USS Enterprise crawled across the endless blue, escorted by destroyers that looked like anxious bodyguards protecting a wounded king. Her once proud hull bore deep, jagged wounds. Her flight deck was torn open like a scar that refused to close. Inside, the air reeked of salt, oil, and scorched steel. Yet her crew refused to let her die. Commander William Davis led the damage control teams, as if every second were a battle of its own. Welding sparks lit the dark corridors. pumps roared. Men worked in knee-deep water, sealing bulkheads and patching ruptures. With scrap metal and desperation, they had no luxury of dry docks or rest, only their will and their tools. One sailor, barely 20, stared at a section of the hangar that had been obliterated by a bomb blast. "We'll never fly from this again," he muttered. Another, older and calmer, handed him a wrench. "Then we'll build it so we can." Every compartment became a workshop. Sheet metal groaned under hammers. Torches hissed as steel fused to steel. The sailors of the Enterprise turned disaster into discipline, transforming chaos into craftsmanship. By the time the carrier reached Numia for temporary repairs, her spirit was already mended, even if her body was not. Crews from the Navy's Service Squadron 10 were waiting, ready to perform miracles. They called it repairing the impossible. Within hours, cranes swung over her deck, welding teams climbed her sides, and mechanics replaced ruined equipment. Captain Hardison met with Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commander of Task Force 61. "How bad?" Kincaid asked. Hardison's reply was steady. "She's bleeding, sir, but she's breathing, and that's all we need." Meanwhile, in Japan, intelligence officers compiled after-action reports. None mentioned the Enterprise among surviving ships. The Shikaku and Zuikaku had achieved what they thought was total victory. Newspapers back home printed headlines, declaring the Pacific clear of American carriers. But as sparks flew and metal rang aboard the Enterprise, a secret was forming in the Pacific twilight. A secret that would soon terrify the Japanese Navy. The dead carrier wasn't just coming back, she was coming back angrier than ever. November 11th, 1942, less than 3 weeks after the devastating attack, the morning sun bathed Numia's harbor in gold as the USS Enterprise slowly backed away from her moon. Her deck was still scarred, the smell of paint and hot metal still sharp, but she was alive, breathing through the rhythmic churn of her engines. Her crew lined the rails, silent, watching the island fade into the distance. Chief Engineer Paul Martin wiped grime from his forehead and looked at the gauges. "She's holding pressure steady," he said, disbelief and pride mixing in his voice. "I don't know how, but she's ready." The impossible had happened. A carrier thought lost, written off in both American and Japanese reports, was now steaming toward the front lines again. The sailors whispered her new name with awe, the Grey Ghost. When the Enterprise rejoined Task Force 16 near the Santa Cruz Islands, even the other ship's crews could hardly believe it. Men on the destroyers saluted as the carrier appeared through the morning haze, her hull gray and battle-worn, her deck lined with freshly repaired aircraft. To them, it was like seeing a spirit rise from the sea. A message flashed through the fleet. The Big E is back. In Tokyo, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted a familiar silhouette in the waters north of Guadalcanal. Pilots returned with confused reports. Carrier matching Enterprise configuration sighted. Admiral Yamamoto refused to believe it. "Impossible," he muttered. "Enterprise was sunk. We confirmed it." But the Americans knew better. They had defied the laws of logistics and engineering. Repair crews in floating workshops had replaced elevator motors, patched flight decks, and restored weapon systems faster than any shipyard in history. Every sailor aboard carried burns, bruises, or scars, reminders of the storm they'd survived, and every one of them wanted payback. That evening, as the crew gathered for dinner in the mess, Captain Hardison stood before them. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady, "they think we're ghosts. Let's haunt them." The room erupted in cheers. Somewhere outside, a mechanic painted a single line of white on the ship's island superstructure, a quiet symbol of survival. The USS Enterprise, the dead ship, was back in the fight. November 14th, 1942. The Solomon Islands. The night sky glowed orange on the horizon, distant flashes marking the brutal naval battles raging off Guadalcanal. The USS Enterprise approached under blackout conditions, her deck crew moving like shadows, guiding aircraft into position for the dawn strike. The Enterprise was the last operational American carrier in the South Pacific. Her sister ships Hornet and Wasp had been sunk. Saratoga was still in repairs. The weight of the Pacific War now rested on this single, battered ship. At 0400 hours, the flight deck came alive. Deck officers shouted through the roaring wind, engines coughed to life, and propellers chopped the damp night air. Pilots climbed into their dauntless dive bombers, Hellcat fighters, and Avenger torpedo planes, their faces lit by the dim red deck lights. "Launch sequence ready," yelled Lieutenant Commander James Jigdog Ramage. leading the first strike group. One by one, the planes leaped into the black sky, silhouettes disappearing toward the faint flashes of battle. Below deck, the engine room pulsed with life, the crew monitoring gauges and generators. The Enterprise had become a floating city of motion, every man working with the precision of a heartbeat. By sunrise, her air wings were above Guadalcanal. Japanese ships, including the battleship Hiei and numerous cruisers, were locked in a deadly brawl with U.S. surface forces. The Enterprise pilots dove through clouds and flak, engines screaming, releasing bombs from 10,000 feet. The first bombs hit home. Geysers of fire erupted across the enemy formation. A Japanese destroyer erupted in flame, its midsection torn apart. Anti-aircraft bursts peppered the sky, tracing black puffs around the American planes. But they kept coming again and again, relentless. Below, aboard Enterprise, spotters watched the sky anxiously. Then came the radio crackle. Target burning. Repeat. Target burning. Returning to base, cheers echoed through the bridge. The crew had waited weeks for this moment, a chance to strike back. Hours later, the returning aircraft landed one by one, scarred but intact. Mechanics swarmed the flight deck, refueling and rearming without pause. The smell of hot oil, salt, and cordite hung thick in the air. Captain Hardison stood on the bridge, binoculars raised, watching the horizon. "So much for ghosts," he muttered. "They'll know we're real soon enough." By dusk, the Enterprise had launched 2 more strikes, crippling enemy ships and turning the tide of battle around Guadalcanal. The Japanese command, stunned by reports of her presence, realized their earlier assumption was wrong. The Enterprise wasn't sunk, it was unstoppable. That night, Tokyo Rose, the infamous propaganda broadcaster, addressed the U.S. fleet over the radio. "To the Americans, tell the ghosts of Enterprise they will not escape next time." The sailors aboard the Big E laughed. Her legend was growing, even among her enemies. She had become more than a ship. She was now a symbol of resilience, defiance, and the will to rise again. Late 1942, the Central Pacific, the Japanese High Command was furious. Intelligence reports had confirmed what they refused to believe. The USS Enterprise, reported sunk months earlier, was not only afloat but had rejoined combat and was spearheading new offensives. Admiral Kiichinaga, the same man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, stared at reconnaissance photos laid across his desk. There it was, a carrier with the distinctive flight deck pattern of the Enterprise. His aide hesitated before speaking. "Sir, it appears she survived." Nagumo's jaw tightened. "Impossible," he muttered. "We saw her hit." The Japanese began calling her the Grey Ghost, a name whispered among pilots and sailors who swore they'd sunk her. Yet somehow, she always returned. To them, it was as if she could not die. She haunted the Pacific like a phantom. Meanwhile, aboard Enterprise, life was far from ghostly. Her decks were alive with ceaseless activity. Crewmen painted over the scars from her last engagement. Welders patched bullet holes as aircraft mechanics tuned engines for the next raid. The smell of fuel and salt water filled every corridor. Captain Osborne Hardison gathered his officers around a table in the chart room. The atmosphere was tense but determined. Maps of the Solomon Islands, Santa Cruz, and Tarawa were spread before them, each marked with bold red circles. "The enemy thinks we're gone," Hardison said. "Let's make sure they regret ever being wrong." Soon after, the Enterprise was once again at the front. Her air wings, VF-10 Grim Reapers, launched precision strikes against Japanese shipping and airfields. Pilots described the thrill and terror of seeing their ship waiting for them after every mission, battered, patched up, but standing tall on the endless sea. During one mission, Lieutenant Stanley Sweetvatasa downed 3 Japanese A6M0s in a single sortie, protecting the Enterprise from what could have been a fatal bombing run. When he returned, deckhands cheered, their faces smeared with oil and sweat. The Enterprise's crew had begun to take pride in her ghostly reputation. They painted small white ghosts beneath her bridge, one for every major engagement she'd survived. Each new battle added another mark, another victory. But the truth was far from invincible myth. Every engagement stretched her to the breaking point. Spare parts were scarce. Planes returned, riddled with holes. Medical teams worked around the clock to tend to the wounded. Still, she endured. Word of her survival spread through Allied ranks like wildfire. To American sailors, the Enterprise became a symbol of hope, proof that no matter how hard they were hit, they could rise again. To the Japanese, she was something else entirely, a harbinger of disaster. During radio intercepts, Allied intelligence began hearing coded phrases from Japanese pilots. "Beware of the ghost ship. The Grey Ghost has returned." It wasn't just a nickname now, it was legend. And legends have power. By early 1943, the Enterprise had become the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy, earning 20 battle stars by war's end. Her reputation alone boosted morale among Allied fleets, and her mere presence could shift the tide of battle. But her journey was far from over. Ahead lay new islands, new battles, and new storms. Each would test the ship and her crew beyond endurance. Yet one thing was certain: no matter how many times she was struck, burned, or battered, the Grey Ghost would always rise again. April 1945. Off Okinawa. The war was reaching its furious climax. Japan's defenses were collapsing, but their desperation had birthed a new, terrifying weapon: the kamikaze. Waves of suicide planes hurled themselves at the Allied fleet in suicidal determination, and once again, standing in the thick of it, was the USS Enterprise. Her decks bore the marks of years of war, patches of scorched steel, faded paint, dents from near misses. She was old now, by wartime standards, but her heart still beat strong. The crew called her Big E, and to them, she was alive, a guardian, a survivor, a legend made of steel and willpower. April 11th, 1945. The Pacific sky was heavy with haze and smoke. Radar operators aboard Enterprise called out rapidly, approaching blips, dozens of them. Incoming bogies, bearing General quarters sounded. Klaxons screamed across the ship. Sailors sprinted to their battle stations, locking hatches, manning anti-aircraft guns. Gunners scanned the horizon through binoculars, their fingers trembling on triggers. Moments later, the first wave appeared. Japanese Zeros, each armed with a single 500-pound bomb, diving from the clouds like meteors. The sky erupted with tracer fire as Enterprise's guns filled the air with lead. Explosions burst all around the ship, geysers of flame rising from the sea. Then one plane broke through. It dove straight for the flight deck. The ship's gunners fired desperately, but the kamikaze held course. At the last moment, it struck near the forward elevator, detonating in a fireball that ripped through the deck. The shockwave threw men to the ground. Black smoke engulfed the ship. For a moment, the Enterprise seemed to vanish in the flames. Below deck, chaos erupted, fires spreading through hangars, ammunition threatening to ignite. Damage control teams rushed in, dragging hoses, sealing compartments, hauling wounded sailors out through the smoke. Lieutenant James O'Hara, leading the fire crew, shouted over the roar of the inferno, "Get that line forward. We lose this deck. We lose the ship." Hours passed in a haze of fire, sweat, and determination. When the flames finally died, the deck was a twisted mess of molten steel, but the Enterprise still floated. Her engines still turned. Her flag still flew. The next morning, from a nearby destroyer, sailors looked across the sea and saw her silhouette rising through the smoke. "The Grey Ghost," one whispered. "She's still here." Even the Japanese pilots watching from afar could hardly believe it. Their reports once again carried the same disbelief that had followed her since 1942. Carrier hit, but not sunk. The Ghost lives. It would be her final battle of the war. The damage was too severe to continue frontline service, but the Enterprise had already done what no other ship could. She had survived every major Pacific engagement from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa. When peace finally came, the Enterprise sailed home in silence. Her decks were quiet now. No planes, no alarms, no flames, only the creak of steel and the sound of waves lapping against her hull. As she entered Pearl Harbor once again, sailors from every ship in port stood at attention. Some saluted, others simply watched in awe. The Big E, the ship that refused to die, had returned home. In total, she earned 20 battle stars, more than any other U.S. warship in World War II. She had been bombed, torpedoed, and burned, but never broken. To the men who served aboard her, she wasn't just a vessel. She was a symbol of endurance, courage, and the American spirit itself. And to those who faced her, the Japanese admirals and pilots who had sworn she was gone, she would always remain something else, a ghost that haunted their war. The USS Enterprise, the Grey Ghost of the Pacific. The sea grew calm again. and the grey ghost drifted toward the horizon scarred, but undefeated. Her return wasn't just a victory of steel and repair crews. It was proof of what human will can resurrect when the world believes you're finished. And just like the Enterprise, our mission here is to bring those forgotten stories back to life. The battles, the machines, the men who refuse to vanish into history's silence. If this story moved you, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with others who still believe history has secrets left to uncover. But tell us, which story should we bring back next? Should we reveal the mystery of the ghost convoys that vanished in the Atlantic? The duel between the German Tiger and the Soviet T-34 that rewrote tank warfare? Or the secret operation that almost ended the war a year earlier? Your voice matters. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them all. And your ideas help decide what truths we uncover next. Because these aren't just stories of the past. They're echoes of courage, still waiting to be heard.